So I'm not going to introduce everybody with their bios. We're going to let them introduce themselves. But we have Diane Morris here, who's going to be leading the panel. Omar Santos, Josh Dembling, and Lisa Bradley. We had one panelist that unfortunately couldn't make it here this morning, Art Manion. So yeah, unfortunately was not able to get out. But fortunately, we have the rest of the folks here, and I'm going to turn it over and let you take it from here, Diane. Are you good? Or actually,
We'll
still
see.
yeah.
See if I can get it.
You have to select the name too. Oh, nope, it's up. You're good to
All
go.
right. All right. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
My name is Diane Morris. I work at Cisco. I am a content manager on Cisco's product security incident response team. So we are the folks who are in charge of putting out security advisories. My team within the PSIRT team is in charge of editing and publishing those advisories. Before I let our panelists introduce themselves, I want to introduce our acronyms of the day. So our title is SBOM plus VEX plus CSAF equals the future of vulnerability management. So SBOM is your software bill of materials. So that is a list of ingredients that is in any piece of software, all the different components that go into making a product. VEX is the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And that was created by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration as a framework for security advisories that let manufacturers both say when their product is affected and when it is not affected. And CSAF is the Common Security Advisory Framework, which is a framework for creating machine-readable security advisories. So I hope that helps. Okay, now I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Omar, why don't you start?
Me?
Well,
Ladies first.
Oh, thank you.
ladies first. Lisa.
Lisa Bradley, I'm a senior director at Dell on the product and application security team. So I have and oversee PSIRT, our open source component management, our SBOM initiative for Dell, security champion, security training program, and our bug bounty program.
Excellent.
I'm Josh Dembling, Senior Director at Intel. I run the Product Security Incident Response Team, the Bug Bounty Program, Security Working Artifacts Team, where we look at industry trends and new regulations and legislation and how that changes the industry. And work to educate both the community as well as inside Intel on good product security practices.
Excellent. My name is Omar Santos. I'm from the Cisco PSIRT team, work with Diane, along with a few others that I see over there. And I'm also the chair of the Common Security Advisory Framework, which is one of the acronyms in there. And I'm actually the founder of BSidesRDU a long time ago. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with just talk SBOMs and how your companies are prioritizing the development of
Let me start.
Yeah.
So I'm very lucky in Dell that we are prioritizing it all the way up the executive chain. So we have a lot of support. As soon as the executive order went out, we put a team together and figured out where we were good and where we were behind. SBOM was one of the ones that we needed to catch up on. And we put together a phase one approach where all of our EO critical products, which was fun in itself to figure out what those were, we went and drove to get SBOMs. So we utilized Black Duck to pull together our SBOMs and our inventory for open source. But even with having a software composition analysis tool, it still took us a significant amount of time and scripting work because we wanted to have what we considered a Dell customer-facing SBOM. So, you know, we had, I think, maybe 1/3 of our product portfolio that we now have SBOMs that we can give to our customers, but there's still a long journey to go in this matter.
And to clarify for folks, the executive order that went out regarding SBOMs came out, was it earlier this year or last year?
Late last year.
Late last year. That basically said that companies that are going to be selling to the federal government have to have software bill of security of materials rather with their products, for their products.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue. I want to take a moment and step back because some of you may not even know what software bill of material means. Think about like the ingredient of anything that you consume, a product, right? Whether it's a hardware-based product, or software, that is made up of third-party components in most cases, and those third-party components in many cases is open source. So what the industry is trying to put together is, for a long, long time, but now it's being part of more legal documents like the executive order. But we're trying to put our heads together is what is the most effective way to know what we're running, to know what we're consuming, and it's an ecosystem. And it's not so much of a single vendor creating an SBOM and you're done. If not that vendor, like in my case, I also consume technologies from other vendors. So it's very nested. So going back to your question, one of the things that we're looking into is not only how to produce this artifact that my customers can consume, but how can we also require our vendors to have that level of consistency for us to consume that and then accelerate that. So it will be, instead of from a software composition analysis tool, which is after the fact, how can I put this in my development practices, even from the moment that I hit commit, or I even decide to use a specific third party or not. So that's in a gist what basically an SBOM and this effort is all about.
You're right, though. Like a lot of it is figuring out how to shift that journey left with the inventory. Like when you're developing, to making sure that you're paying attention to what you're consuming. Because oftentimes we get to the end point and then it's hard to go back and figure out what you put in there because developers leave and your build environments change. So, how do you get it within your typical developer-ready platform activities and know that inventory from the beginning and have the composition analysis tools start earlier on in the process? Because, my good buddy, Alan Friedman, he will say, hey, you get an SBOM by just pushing the button. It's really just not that easy. One of our product teams took 6 weeks just to create the SBOM because of the complexity of it. And then we have vendors like Intel here, where now we're putting the pressure on to have an SBOM also.
Yeah, well, and our journey started similar to Lisa's journey with the EO, but even a bit before that. We all knew this was coming. We
Absolutely.
all started to work on this within our respective companies, but the challenges are not just how you put it together, but to what depth and using what format, and making sure that when we do put it together, we can communicate with each other, share it with each other effectively as needed, right? And so it is definitely a shift left journey, but it's got to start more on the surface, right? Taking what you've got and putting it together.
Yeah, and the journey doesn't stop after you have it. You have to figure out, how are you going to give it to your customers? What customers are you going to give it to? How do you make sure that you protect that information? So, our journey is still continuing on with the SBOM because for me right now, unless you have some kind of contract with me or most likely waiving some kind of big money in front of me, I'm not willingly to give it yet because we're still maturing our processes with it. So we'll continue to grow on that journey, and eventually we will open it up to all customers. But until we really understand how it's going to be used by our customers, are we even delivering the right format to them? We even had a customer that asked us for a certain naming convention of that. Can you imagine if all your customers asked for a different file name of the SBOM? That's just a lot of work. So how do we educate the customer at the same time of what we're going to deliver to them in a standard way? So a lot of activity we've had to worry about.
Now, of course, one of the things about SBOMs is that with all these third-party software tends to be where most of the vulnerabilities that we have to deal with lie, right? So let's talk a little bit about how SBOM connects to security advisories and CSAF.
I guess I can probably take that one. So CSAF, the Common Security Advisory Framework, is only one of the components that is in this ecosystem. It doesn't need an SBOM to function. Basically, we've been doing this for a long time in the industry. Most vendors hopefully, right, they will have a PSR team like ours, and then they will disclose openly the security vulnerabilities that they have. They do that in a security advisory. Some people call it a bulletin, some call it people are noticed, but it's the same thing. Historically, it's a human readable document that we publish, and somebody actually will have to read and say, okay, my product is affected by this, I have to upgrade, and then move on. I used to have a joke in my company, and this has been recorded, this stream, I'm actually streaming it up there, but I always say that if a human is reading my security advisories, I should be fired, right? And I still say that because we have to do this at machine speed. There's so many vulnerabilities out there, so many vulnerabilities that actually do not affect you. And it's a way of, so we have to put our heads together on how to do this in a machine-readable format. A long time ago, in the galaxies far, far away, we were also participant in a forum called ICASI, that is now actually part of FIRST. And when I say we, a whole bunch of vendors, including Microsoft, Intel, and so on, we had multilateral NDAs to exchange vulnerability information. And we wanted to do this in a machine speed. And we created this thing called the Common Vulnerability Repairing Framework. So it's basically a machine-readable advisory. That's what CSAF basically replaced. Now, instead of in this forum that was a little bit more closed, is part of an organization called OASIS. So within CSAF, you have different profiles. You have the normal security advisory that we all know. And then whenever it comes a little bit more pertinent to the SBOM conversation, is this thing called VEX. So VEX, which stands for the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, can be a little profile within an SBOM document. And there's two major standards that the industry is focusing on right now in SBOMs, SPDX and CycloneDX. So within an SBOM, at the moment that you create it, you can actually say, these vulnerabilities don't affect me or under investigation. The challenge with that is that 2 minutes after I publish that information, it becomes obsolete because that vulnerability is under investigation, that may be not affected, or a new vulnerability comes in, right? So it makes that document and that status completely obsolete after you create the SBOM. Where CSAF comes into play with that VEX profile is that you have, if you think about it, an automatic security advisory being generated for you. Basically, it's a response to whatever the status of that vulnerability is in time. So you can query these, essentially with APIs or any other methods in a little bit more intelligent way. And as you go through the vulnerability management process, from obtaining the report of that third-party software vulnerability all the way to the disposition of fixing it or I'm not affected, you actually can query, any system and get that status. And that's what VEX is all about. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense for folks that haven't been exposed to that.
Yeah, I think VEX is interesting because, again, it's not just our product teams then to figure out their impact as soon as possible, because our customers have our SBOMs, and the last thing I want is to have 15 to 50 to 100, who knows how many customers constantly asking every time there's a new OpenSSL vulnerability. So, but all of that work to get that VEX, to get that, that working, it is a lot. You have to figure out how do you tie it in to your ticketing system that you have for your product security ticketing system right now for vulnerabilities. How do you make that impact statement be done by your teams earlier on and understand the importance of why they need to do it quickly? How do you let that engineer team understand that pain that's going to potentially come from our customers if we don't get this information out to them? And how do you make sure it's accurate and up to date and consistent? I mean, there's a lot of work that we're having to do in this. Now, it's an amazing journey that we're on, but the pressure that I feel is that there's a lot of people talking about how quickly it could be done, but this is a lot of process, coding, people, money to make it happen.
It's not just about the technology of implementing it. It's about changing the culture of a company and the way that they think and the way that they operate, the way they develop products, and it can affect innovation. So you have to do this in a bit of a systematic way. While it's a shift left journey, again, you have to start with what you have and integrate yourself into the business very carefully. so that you don't disrupt the business revenue. And the higher you are up in the food chain, the technology ecosystem, the more important it is that you are on this journey, because everybody that you feed down is going to be relying on this, because like Omar pointed out, everybody's going to get flooded with all these advisories, all these reports of security vulnerabilities, and they're going to need to be able to make decisions faster and faster at the speed of a machine. And that's why this is so important.
Yes, as a matter of fact, you brought an amazing point, actually, both of you. And I'm trying to look for things that are controversial, so I don't actually agree 1,000% with them. Like a friend of mine always says, everything in a PowerPoint orchestrates and works perfectly, right? In practice, it's a lot different. It's a monumental task, especially whenever you have 1,200 products in my case, and you guys are pretty much in the same shoes.
Yeah.
And getting the culture in place, getting the tools in place, getting the customers educated, as you mentioned, it is a monumental task. It's not going to be like, these acronyms are just, machine readable documents. I'm not going to diminish the work that we have done in CSAF, because it's been tremendous. But we can come up with a specification like that, no time. Putting it to work is significant.
And you bring up a really good point, that it's you have to have real support from the company that you're with, like we all have, to be able to be involved in evolving these kinds of technologies, these methodologies. Like Omar said, I mean, this has been years in the making. The kind of interaction, collaboration that we've had for more than a decade on getting to this point has been critical for the success of our companies, but they've allowed us the opportunity to be a part of this. They've embraced this. And without that, I think it's hard to be successful.
I do think, though, the executive order, as much as it's a pain,
It's a good trigger.
it's a good trigger, right? I mean, it was things that we wanted to do and have a journey for that would have took a long time. Now we had a hard fact document that the company had to follow, or they would lose business. And when you speak those kind of terms to the right people, things will happen. And I think there, as much as it's been a lot of work, I am grateful for the executive order. I'm not grateful for the amount of regulatory asks that are coming down on top of that. But I'm grateful for the first step with the executive order.
Yeah, it's a trigger. The executive order in the U.S. is a trigger, but also has triggered other governments too. So it's not only about being compliant or being able to sell to the federal government, but right now in ESA, in some proof of concept with them, they're looking into SBOMs as one of the components, but also even pre-disclosure of vulnerabilities, which is a conversation for another day. We can probably have another 3 panels on that.
Yeah.
So it is going to take a lot of effort from vendors, from the consumers, from the government, from the industry to actually get educated, because it's a phased approach. What Lisa mentioned about software composition analysis tool, that's the first step. We're in the same shoes. Pretty much the whole industry, whether they tell you otherwise or not, it's pretty much in the same shoes, right? You're reacting into this, looking into what is in your source code or in a binary, right? And then there's no magic bullet that I can just press a button and say, I'm going to put this into my CI/CD pipeline, and then tomorrow I'm going to have SBOMs, VEX, and all the acronyms in the world. That doesn't exist right now. Hopefully, we'll move to that in 5-10 years. Hopefully, right? Hopefully, I'll be alive by then. but it's going to take a significant amount of time. So the call for action is that we all get educated and we all try to actually solve this together, right? Because it's an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about why the executive order came down. What is the implication for national security with SBOMs?
I mean, I was going to actually say, I think this has got more to do with the trend that you're seeing with government agencies and even within the industry. It's really finding a way to push people to disclose vulnerabilities faster, to be more responsive to security vulnerabilities, to have processes and standards that they follow consistently in how they handle security vulnerabilities, and then bring people together so that we communicate it from vendor to vendor. And I think that was a culmination of the trigger that launched that, but there's so many other things in legislation.
Yes, I think SolarWinds was one of the major triggers that the government will say because of SolarWinds, but there also was,
It goes way
the
back.
pipeline, and everything in supply chain has just always been an issue. But I mean, the executive order has a lot more than just SBOM. And to be honest, if your company feels that just having an SBOM is the answer, they're wrong. There's just so much more to it. Having, SDL practices, having, contracts with your vendors, having a good vulnerability response program. I think everybody's been focusing on SBOM because it's a trendy name, and then VEX came along, it's another trending name. So it's a lot of fun to focus on that, but there's so much more that you need to have in order to be successful in the space. And even when you're one of the best in it, you still can easily fail. I mean, every day there's new vulnerabilities. I'm sure just as we're speaking, there was, hundreds that probably came out, and that part is there's a lot of work ahead, which is great because we're in this field. I think we did good job security, but.
Oh, we may die before we see the solution. Even though you mentioned Alan Freeman is a good friend of all of ours, he led an effort in the NTIA of SBOMs, and even before him, a lot of companies. That's the reason that Black Ducks and the White Source and a whole bunch of other companies assist. They want to help individuals to see what they're consuming. Think about, and this is an analogy that I think Alan or Josh Corman actually used. Think about that you're actually consuming something, that you're eating. And most of us, we actually look at the list of ingredients. Does this have too much sugar for me? I'm probably diabetic and blah, blah, blah. So the same thing that comes with software or hardware. Knowing what you're running, it is essential, right? If you don't know what you're running, then how in the world are you going to be able to determine what vulnerabilities affect you or not? Now, how these SBOMs and all these efforts started was because of other legal compliance and licensing. Like, you're using open source, so I'm going to disclose what open source packages I have. And for years, we have been doing that in PDF documents, and then says, I'm using OpenSSL, I'm using Linux kernel, but it doesn't go into the granularity of saying this is a version of Linux kernel, or this is how I'm using it. And for you to determine a vulnerability, if you're vulnerable or not, you have to know not only the version, am I actually compiling this into the way that actually affects my product? And a good friend of ours too from Oracle, he actually did a study, and most of their vulnerabilities that they actually face don't affect them. They're not exploitable, right? And if you look at that, through many other vendors, and that's one of the reasons that we actually, trying to put our heads together with VEX and these standards is to also allow for you to know what are false positives. In the perfect world will be that somebody, instead of actually running a scanner and then calling support and say, are you really affected by this, vulnerability that Qualys or Tenable or whoever tells you that you have, and then you have to get that person to talk to one of my guys, and one of my guys talk to engineering, and then engineering look into their code. If you can automate that in the future, that's of course the perfect world scenario. It is easier said than done, right? But that's what the main purpose of these efforts are.
I have a different perfect world.
But we don't introduce that vulnerability from the first place.
Yeah.
That would be the perfect world.
My perfect world is that we always pick up the latest and greatest of what we're consuming. But we all know that it's really expensive to do that, which is why we take the time to do the analysis to indicate if we're affected or not. Because half the time when we bring in open source, we write a lot of code around it, we have wrappers, and so it's very expensive. And it don't even get me on the OS updates and how expensive they are. So in a perfect world, though, where I think we will eventually get is that every release, which will hopefully be a consistent and only security update release, that's what I always talk about in my company, will, a customer will always know when they're getting that next update, and they will always know that they had the latest and greatest. Or maybe it's just a continuous update that's constantly going on. Although that is scary when you customer state, am I really pay deploying this update, or is it going to break something? So there's a whole other journey that goes on around it where I think we need to go.
My perfect world is a combination of the two. I think that it's important to recognize that what we're really doing is helping customers assess risk. So by eliminating some of the challenges that customers would have by ensuring we're updating to the latest version is important. I think that's important for many reasons, the stability of your product and keeping up with the changes that are made in the components that you're integrating into your technology. But it's also important to be able to give people a better understanding of how exposed they really are, because as Omar pointed out today, it's a very manual effort. It's an ad hoc discussion that happens between engineers rather than something that people can look at and make a split-second decision on and say, yeah, I understand what the vulnerabilities and how it affects that product. I know my risk, although the severity of the vulnerability may be high, my risk is much lower in my implementation. But today, that's more of a subjective decision using anecdotal information rather than an objective.
Well, and it also takes customers understanding and being okay with receiving that.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of the customers, if they have a scan and it's indicating you have a vulnerability, even though you have a whole documentation of why you're not affected, some of them have rules. They're like, I'm sorry, we have to shut our program, our system down if we scan and see something. So, I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen to our customers and to those execs, that say you need to be on this. Like Log4j was a really good example. We had customers saying you need to be on that 2.17.1. I'm like, no, like eventually, yes, I want to get to that, but you really need to be on that 2.16. And but that education and understanding, we're very far from it still.
Looking at your ideal world, sounds like customers maybe aren't ready there. I mean, how are your customers dealing with? Are they prepared to deal with SBOM and VEX and CSAF? Are they ready to consume that and make sense of it?
I don't think we are.
I think
Clean
it's a journey,
ourselves.
right? Because, so as my customers, right, being able to feed you my information, I have to partner with my customers on the formats and the approach that we would take so that they're able to consume it. I have to understand what they were looking for. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg experience.
Right.
I think that if you ask 5 people, you're going to get 20 answers in the customer side. The reason that I said that is because depending on the amount of resources that you have, whether you have SBOMs or not, they have a different way of ingesting security vulnerabilities. And that's the reason that I said, the perfect world is not introducing the vulnerability from the beginning. That's easy said than done, right? That's another effort. But how you're going to see this probably in the industry is that some customers are not going to have the infrastructure in place to even know what am I going to do with these 1,000 lines in here? Am I going to even ask the right questions? Is the vulnerability in the Linux kernel more impactful than OpenSSL, right? So you see a lot of even companies now. As a matter of fact, we have one outside with Stern Security. They are digesting SBOMs to provide risk information to a customer. The other thing is that even if you look at SBOMs or VEX, this is a continuous thing, right? More vulnerabilities will come in, more vulnerabilities will be remediated or will be determined they're false positives. If you think about the way that historically we have put things in our networks or in the cloud, that you have to go into a certification process, or this product cannot have any vulnerabilities on it, and you work with the customer for 6 months, and then they point fingers to my team. Oh, you just publish another vulnerability. This product is now, well, we have to publish. We have to be, transparent. If you look at open source vulnerabilities, as Lisa and Josh, they're coming as we speak. Somebody's actually finding one right now. So they're at constant state of not being compliant. Is that we have to educate the whole industry and the consumers, because there will never, I can guarantee you, there will never be a single product in the whole world that will be vulnerability free. Ever. It's a matter of us actually being able to ingest this information so we can make decisions into how to protect it, how to remediate it, and how to prioritize this stuff. There will never be, whoever sells you that I have a vulnerability free product, just turn around and just buy something else.
Or a system for developing products that's vulnerability free. It's just, I remember having this discussion at a conference once, and somebody asked me, what's the single biggest risk to our products today? And I said, it's anybody that's sitting down to write code. It's not It's not the technology. It's how we design it, how we write it, how we build it. And it's not to say that those people that do it are bad or flawed or uneducated. It's just a fact of life. Security has evolved over the decades. How we develop products has evolved. The technology that we had 30 years ago is outdated, so the methodologies are also outdated, and we've learned from that. So we're continuing to grow and evolve and mature. That's what makes this a journey and not a destination.
How are we doing on time?
We still have, we're back 12 minutes. I just want to do one more question before we turn to the audience. So the response I hear so often when we get into a conversation about SBOMs and VEX is, aren't you giving the hackers a blueprint? How do you guys respond to that?
I can take it.
Go ahead.
So I was presenting with a few other folks in that DEFCON around the same topic at the policy desk, and it was KCLE, Katy, Missouri, a whole bunch of more intelligent people than me. But we were all talking about the expectation that some attacker, threat actor, can be a criminal, can be a national state organization, that they will be running. They probably have a better SBOM than you. That's number one thing, right? So the way of us thinking that, no, this is a big problem because I'm going to publish it out and somebody's going to share it and then that's going to be taken advantage of. Yeah, you can accelerate that, but they can buy the black dogs of the world. As a matter of fact, they are buying, these type of things to do the software composition analysis and actually know what they're running, right? So it is time for us that we're trying to protect to know about that. However, what we have to do is not so much of, can we put it in repositories, and that's a technical nerd fights that I have to deal with, right? Because I'm a nerd. But where to put profile information in machine readable format so I can predict where you put this information, right? That's the things that we're trying to do in the standard. But in the real world, how you're gonna probably see this is that originally it's gonna be on a per request type of transaction, right? And your customer that is going over and certifying your product and putting it into some process to acquire it, and they're probably going to ask that as a checklist, right? And you're going to see that a lot because they're probably not even going to know what they're asking for, but they're actually just asking for this thing and you provide it to them. And in the perfect world will be, of course, that you have it in a specific repository, that the product itself actually has some type of manifest that it tells you that, and then you can query. There's another protocol that we didn't even put in there. It's called MUD, and where the actual product itself can tell you where you put the security advisories information on, and so on. So that's the futuristic type of it. What we're seeing at Cisco is more in a transactional phase yet, and even for VEX, you don't need an SBOM for VEX. That's my kind of joke. It's a question. Somebody's going to ask you, what is your status of CVE 12345 in your products? So that's what VEX starts for. We do have those mechanisms right now. Sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's an API call, sometimes it's an advisory, right? But that's what you're gonna see, kind of baby steps out there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I actually was thinking about it, and my concern is not that we're giving more information, but will people understand what to do with the information that we're giving them? So that's where my head goes at with it. I want to protect it as much as I can right now, because there's so much more maturity with doing dependency management. Now that we have the SBOMs, how do we know about the vulnerabilities? How do I make sure that all my product teams, like if there's an OpenSSL vulnerability, then I'm instantly scanning those SBOMs, know what products are consuming it, making sure they know about that vulnerability and that we're ahead of the game and we're not having our customers saying, hey, you have this vulnerability in this because we have your SBOM. So that's why, for me, I'm a little bit hesitant, but it's more because I want to make sure I have everything else in the background working really well so that, my customers aren't telling me something I should already know. The other thing, and I just want to mention it because I feel like we missed it in it, and I'm thinking about it, is that one of the biggest things with SBOM, we're all having a little difficulty, is that there's no common naming. So you were talking about in the past, and in my past company, we had all the licensing, but someone would say Apache Struts, another person would say Struts, another person would say Apache Struts version 1. Like, so there's so much inconsistency in the naming convention, and us in the industry haven't attached to one thing. And I think that because of that, we're all struggling. And so if my SBOM and your SBOM uses a different name for struts, are we, like, what is our customer going to do? Like, they have to code for all these different naming things. So that, I feel like, is still a huge gap that we haven't figured out. And I don't feel like anyone's actually taken a stance to say, hey, this is what we should use. We're all sort of, we use black ducks, so I'm going to utilize black ducks. But if all the black ducks of the world don't talk to each other, then they're all going to have different naming conventions.
Yeah, no, and back to Omar's point though, I'm not worried about as much about the painting a clear path to the malicious actors of the world. I think they're reverse engineering our technology and they understand it probably just as well as they need to be able to do what they do. At the same time, I don't necessarily want to make it any easier than I have to. So I want to provide enough information to our customers all down the chain so that they can make the right risk decisions and they understand what they need and how they need to fix their environment. But that's less of a concern of mine with SBOM.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Do we have from the audience? Yeah. Hi.
So you guys are here representing companies with headcount and budget and customers who are demanding these things, financial responsibilities to provide this. All these things, as the classic XKCD cartoon shows, is based on open source projects by that one guy who maintains it on the weekend. What about those guys? Are there some public or private partnerships that help some of these open source
That's a great,
Yeah.
that's a really great point.
I should repeat
Open
the question.
SSF.
Yeah.
I'm
So
sorry.
we'll repeat the question. You were talking about how are we helping that Joe Schmo who's writing the open source code. So Open SSF, the Open Source Software Security Foundation, did I say that right? So there has been a big initiative and a significant amount of big companies have poured money into it and the focus, there's a lot of focus on it. One of the focuses, though, is to try to figure out how do we make the open source more secure in the first place? How do we do that grading of the open source so that, a product team, when they're choosing, they pick one that maybe is more secure? So you're exactly right, though. We need to figure out how do we, if we're using these open source, how do we pour the money back into it to make them more secure in the first place? So that, we don't have a Log4j issue happening on a Friday, type of thing. So there's a big effort. If you don't know about it, you should look into it. But I know my company, I'm assuming yours, both of yours are contributing into it, to be able to help the whole ecosystem of open source.
But I think even beyond OpenSSF and being a part of that as a company, if you're using open source, you should be looking to invest in it. I mean, Intel has got a big effort around that, around not just investing in the industry groups that are supporting the idea, but then if you're going to use that technology, let's make sure that we're either contributing to it, we're a maintainer of it, we're somehow influencing it, we're communicating with the maintainers in any way that they're willing to communicate with us, because some maintainers don't want to.
And that helps for the big ones, but I mean, there's
Even the
tens
little
of
ones,
thousands
right?
of open source,
Yeah,
right?
But you have to start with the ones that, that point of open source, right? You start with the ones that you're using and make sure you're investing in those, that you're supporting those, which are likely used by others.
So I have two examples. So I agree 1,000% what they said. Also agree 1,000% and one with the last comment of anybody can actually make an open source project and somebody can consume it. And even though as a vendor, software producer, consumer, we have to get better on determining what is good infrastructure of open source that I should be consuming and what should be potentially outside of, So going back to your question about the investment, I'll give you an example. After Heartbleed, forget about Log4j, this long time ago, right? Heartbleed was kind of the wake-up call. Oh my God, people are using OpenSSL and that's 2/3 of the internet. We have to pay attention to security. Cisco, we looked at, okay, what are the things that are critical infrastructure? Is it the kernel? Well, that's people giving money to that. Is it X, Y, and Z? And then, we're spoiled because we have money and we give, to these efforts, right? And we said, what about time? What about NTP? And if NTP fails, certificates fail and everything else. So we started a little project with an organization called ASIC and Talos and, and university. And we look at NTPD. And nobody had looked at vulnerabilities ever, right? Not even a static analysis, because we were looking for vulnerabilities and it was like free, CVEs out there, right? So whenever it comes to that, we probably have to collectively say, okay, what are the top, consume critical infrastructure open source components, and that's what OpenSSF is actually trying to do, and the Linux Foundation and many other folks. Second, what can we invest? And more importantly, why we should not be consuming some things that probably are not supported anymore, but we are using it in critical infrastructure products that we actually sell, right? So that's one of the things that we have to also look in this ecosystem, and it's not as easy as an SBOM or a VEX. It's actually a whole development shift.
Yeah, that's a whole journey. So
We have enough time for one more question. Any other questions out there? Way in the back.
Yeah, it seems like today, this is an FBI release reporting with like the top exploited vulnerabilities. How does SBOM help address a lot of those that seem like they may not be reliant on third-party open source dependencies like proxy shell or this preeminent vulnerability that just comes?
yeah, so the question is about CISA has been publishing actively exploited vulnerabilities and making the rest of the industry aware that they know that exploits are happening. They did it because they wanted their own government agencies to address vulnerabilities at a certain speed. So they actually said, hey, this is being actively exploited. This is how quickly you should fix it. I haven't tied it in with SBOM yet, although I will with the full dependency management. But where I tied it in is more into my high profile process. So when a vulnerability is being actively exploited, we typically call it a high profile, especially if it's rampant and utilized in a lot of products. So I've been utilizing that information to help, hey, is this something that Dell is using, and what are we widespread affected or not? And we need to then faster do it. But is Dell actually using it is where SBOM comes into play. If you have your SBOMs, you could quickly know that you're utilizing that open source, or a lot of them are even vendor issues. And then you can quickly notify those product teams. So it certainly will play in the picture as we continue to mature our processes.
I think that's
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.